Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research and education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr. Tracey A. Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. All right, welcome everyone to another installment of the Research to Practice podcast. We have a wonderful friend, colleague, researcher, academic, mother, former principal, and force in the field of education, Dr. Jillian LaSerna. Welcome, Dr. LaSerna. It's very nice to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on the podcast today.
So we'd like to start just with allowing you to self-introduce around who you are for the listeners today. So if you would take a moment to introduce yourself.
That's can be a really deep question. Who am I? Let's see. So I think I would, in a nutshell, describe myself in all the ways you did. So briefly, I've been in education my entire career. I started as a classroom teacher in California, working in elementary schools, moved to North Carolina and continued as a bilingual literacy specialist, and then moved on to, I did my undergrad in liberal studies and teaching credential in California. Once I got to North Carolina, I continued teaching and got my MSA in school administration and my EDD in educational leadership from UNC Chapel Hill, and took a position as an assistant principal and then as a principal of a bilingual elementary school with a two-way immersion program. And then I conducted my dissertation research also in dual language programs, and quickly found that I was really interested in research and what research meant for practice. And I found my dissertation work, although I didn't research the school I worked in, I found it resonated with what I saw in my own school, and quickly begun trying to implement changes in my school based on the dissertation research and data I had collected in other school sites. And so I realized, I want to continue and try to publish this work and really try to make an impact through research on practice. And so that's how we met. Is I took a position at UNC Charlotte to continue exploring research and also teaching adults. I feel like I'm always a teacher at heart. So I was at UNC Charlotte for 3 years, and I moved then to the education policy initiative at Carolina in the Department of Public Policy at UNC Chapel Hill, and have been there just over a year. And that position allows me to continue researching ed policy and to make very practical findings and suggestions for the field. So it's a good fit.
Wonderful. So truly sort of practice the research, right? So the opposite of the practice of research, but implementing research-based practices. And we often hear leaders say, we institute research-based practices, right? Which often can be used as a catchphrase, right? If we say that, we automatically have credibility if there's absolutely no research behind what we're doing. But in your case, you implemented the research from your dissertation. So can you talk a little bit about what the findings were and then how you implemented that in practice?
Yeah, I was just saying best practices, research-based practices. I feel like educators are completely numb to those words because we say them without providing the actual research that the practice comes from. So my dissertation looked at culturally relevant pedagogy in dual language classrooms. And really what I did was look through Latson-Billings framework, looking for academic success, cultural competence, and sociopolitical consciousness. So I looked for those 3 areas, and I did so through classroom observation, teacher interviews, and lesson plan document analysis. So looking at the curriculum and instructional plans. And what I found was, and I limited my sites to what we would deem based on state test scores, schools that were having success in literacy. So that was my sample pool. So I looked to see in those schools, what do we see with culturally relevant pedagogy? And what I found was there was a huge focus on academic success, and a real buy-in there, school-wide and also in the classrooms. And I found some evidence of cultural competence also in the classrooms. And then what I didn't find really hardly at all is any work around sociopolitical consciousness, or I think what now is often referred to as critical consciousness in the literature. And so what I realized as I was back in my own school as a principal doing my, regular instructional walkthroughs, I thought, wow, if I conducted my exact same study on my school right now, I would find the same things.
Gotcha. Can I pause you there? Because I wanted to get into these terms, right? That are big terms that folks often throw out there. Like, yeah, the first one you said, cultural competence, correct?
Yes.
And or culturally relevant pedagogy. Folks use this all of the time to mean a number of different things. And so, can you explain for those who are educators, who aren't educators, what do you mean by, cultural relevance? Like, what were you looking for?
Yeah. So I really looked at it through, again, the criteria that Gloria Ladson Billings sort of laid out. And what I was looking for specifically is thinking about the students in the classroom. Is there curriculum, instruction, activities, opportunities for whatever is happening instructionally to connect directly to the students' cultures that are sitting in the seats? So, is there a direct relationship happening between instruction and the students' cultures that they're bringing into the classroom?
Gotcha. So, can we get a for example? So, in your study, what were the cultures of the students in the classroom, and what did you see when you did the observations, right? Because it could be super nebulous, right?
Yeah.
But what did you see? Like, oh wow, it exists here.
So the classrooms were pretty diverse. I would say, the three primary student groups were white students, there were Black students, and there were Latinx students in the classroom. Those are the majority. Of course, there were some AAPI students in the classroom as well. And so, what I would look for are things like what book selections are made. I only looked at literacy. So, what texts are being selected? What representation are on the walls, what books are in the classroom libraries. I would ask questions of the educators, like what they do to draw connections, both with their students, but also for students to have interactions with each other in celebrating their cultures and really their knowledge, their background, their expertise that they're bringing into the classroom. Another thing you might look for is school hallways. What kind of things are posted out in the hallway or in the main entryways? And then also looking at assignments that students are doing. So what types of assignments are students writing about? What types of reflections are they doing? Are they connecting text to their own culture when there is a dissonance there? So things like that.
Gotcha, gotcha. And so, what I heard you say is that you found some evidence in
Mhm.
several classrooms that this was in fact a thing,
Yeah.
right? So you said socio-political, I forget the term that you used. Now
Yeah.
that's something that's like I think is me myself, I have no idea what that means. So you didn't find this. What is that, and how would you find that? What would you look for?
Okay, so sociopolitical consciousness or critical consciousness, right? This is where you are really looking for opportunities for students to be analytical about the world that they're in and recognize different systemic structures of oppression that exist. And one, bringing an awareness, but two, also thinking about their actions. So, like on an individual sort of student level, like having them reflect on that, but also like what would they like to do about it? Like what could they see themselves doing about the systems of oppression that they recognize?
Gotcha. And what grade levels were in your research study?
3 to 5.
Okay, so we always, at least in our work, not always, but we get frequently that students are too young for this
Yeah.
sort of socio-political thought. We don't want to sort of muddy their minds with oppression, right? What do you say
Mhm.
to that for folks who sort of had that perspective that it's too young?
I think there's age appropriate ways to address many a topic, right? And students begin asking questions about different issues about like society, different things that they notice at a very young age. And so having an interaction with students there, of course you're going to do things in an age appropriate, just like we teach reading in an age appropriate way, right? We have, so for an example, you have books about trains in kindergarten, you have books about trains in fifth grade, and you have books about trains for high schoolers, right? Those
Mhm.
books look different in every grade level, but we don't say, oh, trains are a really complicated means of transportation and the way trains work is really complicated. So we don't talk about that in K1 or second grade.
Mm. And so I'll give you a for example. It's like, so say you have a third grader
Yeah.
and, they're watching the news,
Hmm.
right? And they're thinking about the most recent topic around the elimination of affirmative action. They're like, what is that? And why is that so bad for us to eliminate that? Because
Mhm.
they will have questions. I mean, kids listen, they have no idea what that means, but they know that people are talking about it, right?
Yeah.
How would you do it? Explain that to them in an age appropriate way.
I'm going to use an analogy to help
Yes.
explain like affirmative action that actually is not mine. This is my friend's. I just want to be clear. This is not my analogy. This is my friend who is an educator. This is his analogy
Gotcha.
and how he talks to kids when they ask him about what does affirmative action really mean. And he says, like, let's go out to the track and run a race. And I'm going to say go, but I'm going to have you stay here when your turn. You're going to stay here and we're going to let everybody else is going to start running. And then when they get 3/4 of the way around, I'm going to tell you it's your turn to go. Right. So does that seem fair? Right. And so that's the analogy he uses to try to, again, take this very abstract concept to help students like understand what does this mean when they ask questions about it.
Gotcha. And that's such a brilliant sort of conceptual way for students to understand, right? Because they're not going to understand the whole history and oppression and,
Mhm.
sort of the legacy of racism and structural racism in our society, but they do understand the concept of that having an unfair advantage
Yeah. Yeah.
as a foundation to begin to build upon that as a foundation.
Students do ask questions about this is the thing. It's like if we don't, we might not discuss it. That doesn't mean students are not absorbing, learning about, engaging what's happening around them.
Right. And also they learn what are taboo topics, right?
Yes.
So we teach them unintentionally what we don't talk about.
Yes,
And
we
that's
do.
the real harm around all of this is that
Yes.
as adults, we have so much trouble, especially across racial lines, talking to each other around topics of such as racism, such as affirmative action, because as kids, we're given the opportunity to develop the language and comfort with it. So I think that's another powerful aspect to sort of doing this work in a way that we expose kids at a young age, at least conceptually, so I can get a level of comfort. So you mentioned
Oh,
sociopolitical consciousness. The fourth aspect that you were looking at, I forget what it was, but can you sort of name what that was that you didn't see and what that means?
yeah. Okay. So sociopolitical consciousness is sort of in much writing becomes synonymous or very similar to critical consciousness is often what
Okay.
people refer to now, and so it really means the same thing. It's this awareness of societal oppression and where you are in that. And so what I did at my school, what I noticed is that this was something that was absent, and so we really engaged in a lot of work to embed social justice explicit standards in our instruction.
Mm,
So as a response to this, like, oh, if you have literacy objectives, you have math objectives, you have science objectives, and that's what teachers are teaching to when they plan their lesson plan and when they engage in instruction, because we have learning goals. And so when we looked at there are social justice standards, and so embedding those into the lesson plans really makes an impact in terms of like whether you're teaching that or not. And then you begin thinking like, oh, this is one of my objectives I'm teaching to. This is going to change the text I select. This is going to change kind of the Socratic seminars I'm going to plan. This is going to change, writing assignments we might have. And so that was a really kind of really systematic way to try to make sure that we weren't ignoring this entire element of culturally relevant pedagogy in our instruction.
wonderful, wonderful. So I'm gonna ask the question that so we see writ large right now is like anti-wokeism. And if someone's listening, they're like, oh my gosh, this is the woke curriculum. Like you're indoctrinating our kids, right? That's the political atmosphere we're in right now. And the antithesis and the counter to that is that how do we prove that this is actually good for kids? What are the student outcomes that we would look for amongst these students to say that, they didn't have this before, but now we've added to the curriculum? And why, how do you measure that it's good for them, that it's beneficial
Mhm.
to their learning?
So I think, when we think about the standards, I'm just going to read you an example of a standard, right? I know about my family history and culture and about current and past contributions of people in my main identity group. That doesn't seem too, you know, scary, but how valuable is that for students, right? And that means all students. every group of students that's in the school, right? Here's another example. I like knowing people who are like me and different than me, and I treat each person with respect. So these are just, again, I just read, two of the standards this is from the social justice standards. It's really, they call them, it's a the Learning for Justice Anti-Bias Framework, and it's put out by Learning for Justice. So,
And
and
when you
I
yeah.
don't work for them.
But you could get a good plug in there for as a
Yeah,
resource. And when you say it, when you like that, it makes sense. But when you get into the political realm, right,
yeah,
individuals who just are functioning out of fear, like you're indoctrinating people, you're sort of feeding folks what's bad about America and anti-white and anti-American, and that's the theme. But when you read the standard, it makes sense basically, and also up against the backdrop of residential segregation. A lot of our students outside of school aren't in these highly diverse, racially diverse environments. They're
yeah.
the only space they get to interact with each other outside of watching TV and getting indoctrinated with the news and sort of public media
Mhm.
is in school. And so we need to be more purposeful around bringing folks together to understand difference. I think
Yeah.
is the foundation of the purpose of social justice education.
Hmm.
And so I want to transition to a current research
Great.
project that you're working on, which I think is awesome in a number of ways. And I think the new title is Bias in Student Recognition Awards.
Hmm.
Right?
Yes.
And I want to sort of frame this around that for those who aren't educators, and for those who are, that PBI, positive behavior support and incentives, is all the rage. Was it the rage 5 years ago? It's still around. We want to have positive
Hmm.
incentives, not just a system where we have consequences for misbehavior, but we want to reward positive behavior. And so that as an umbrella, understanding that is positive for students within school, folks have bought into that. And
Hmm.
also within that, we need to recognize that bias does work its way in to advantage some students and disadvantage others. So
Great.
first, can you tell us about like what even drew you to do a research study like this? Like, why would you even think that this was worthy of study?
A couple things, right? So, I feel like my entire career I've seen, and not just associated with, necessarily positive behavior incentives, but think about like awards that are given like at the end of the year to students. I feel like this has been around again since the time I initially started teaching. Awards that are given at graduation ceremonies. Students are left often wondering, how did that student get that award? Was I supposed to apply to that award? What was the criteria for that award? How would I would have loved to earn that award, or this is an award for, science, and I love science. So I wonder how I could have gotten that, right? There's a lot of unknowns for students and how awards are given or how recognition is given often, right? So this is something that had been in my mind, I think, as an educator for a really long time. Just around this idea of how students are selected. Do students understand how, who's selected for an award and who's not, and what's the criteria for an award that you might achieve? And so I think you have this everything from, in the classroom to larger awards. And I think that, bias is present as much as, as individuals, we may try to, recognize our own biases that we have and try to, take action to try to address those. Bias can work its way into, just like we know about discipline, which has been
Hmm.
well researched and well written on, right?
Yeah.
We talk about the gap in student office referrals, expulsions, suspensions. And when we think about that, we see a real disparity in like the number of white students who are referred when you compare to the number of Black students who receive office referrals or Latinx students who receive office referrals. There's a huge discrepancy there. And so I thought, in my experience, just anecdotally, this is something I've noticed. I wonder if this is the case.
Right. Wonderful. Yeah, and that attaches to my experience as very, very personal to me as well. When I knew that you were doing, I was like, oh my gosh, absolutely. Because I remember in my history, I was bused. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I was part of the 220 program, which was a program to desegregate the suburban schools, right? So we
Mhm.
were the Black kids bused to the suburbs. And I noticed from the time I was there, from third grade all the way through high school, is the same group of AG, academically gifted white kids every year that would get the awards. And we
Mhm.
sit in the audience, and same train of white kids from third grade all the way through high school. from the same group. And I saw that maybe once in a while there would be a kid of color, maybe, but the
Mhm.
criteria was definitely exclusive to be rewarded. You have to be one of the privileged white kids on the AG check, and that's the only thing that was rewarded. And then flash forward to when I was a principal, I noticed that a lot of the graduation rewards in my school that I led was the same thing,
Mhm.
And this is
Yeah.
early 1990s when I was or actually early 1980s when I was in elementary school. Flash forward to 2010, it was the same phenomena.
Well, and I think, one of the things I didn't look at, but I think is an area that really would be interesting to study is this more in a qualitative perspective is what is that impact that what's being reinforced to students as we watch sort of recognition over and over of students who look a certain way. What is the impact on students of that? Right. So, what does that say? Again, unspoken, but what is sort of reinforced? And again, this is something I think would be fascinating for a future research project, a qualitative study, where you'd really talk to students about, what they notice about awards and recognitions, because you're sharing your story, you noticed,
Right.
so I think this is something that would be really interesting for, a future study.
All right, signing up the future study, the impact, right, of student recognition in racial bias. I know from my feeling, I just feel like Black kids weren't smart. That's what it said to me. Like we
Mhm.
were never going to be the academically gifted students. Brown kids weren't smart, right? You had to be white or Asian to be considered one of the smart kids, and the Black kids, especially if you come from Milwaukee, you will never be a smart kid.
Mhm.
Right. And I remember that very distinctly, but it became normal. Like, because at the time you can't ingest what that really is. I'm just like, okay, well, all right. Heather
Yeah.
again. Yep. Nora again. Okay.
Yeah.
Every year, same kids. So, talk to us a little bit about the study. So, what was the sort of the nuts and bolts of the study?
Yeah, so the study really looked at across two different school sites, recognition awards that were given over throughout the year to students for scholastic achievement or for excellence in scholastic activities for a given period of time. So it recognized students across two sites that had similar systems. Both were PBIS schools, and so this was just part of a recognition awards that was offered to students for you know different things. One school, in the findings, which did make a difference, one school had much more clear criteria for scholastic awards, different things you might be looking for, where the other school did not have as much of a criteria. And this really made an impact both on, I think, some of the percentages of students that were receiving awards, but also especially on the qualitative information that teachers would say about students receiving the awards. So again, having that criteria, and in fact, that's one of the implications, is it did seem to make a difference.
Okay. So what did you find?
Yeah. So across, in I'm just going to pull up, so because I don't have all the numbers memorized, so I just want to be able to
Oh, absolutely.
let you know. Okay, so for scholastic awards in one year, white students made up 54% of the school, but received 73% of the scholastic awards in year one, and made up 55% of the school in year two and received 75% of the scholastic awards. Now, in the other school that I mentioned had stronger criteria, had a much closer percentage in year one, but white students were still slightly overrepresented in year two, but not as much as the school without the specific criteria for scholastic awards. And then when you go down and look at the rest of the data, I'll just again concentrate on the first school without the criteria. When we look at Latinx students, they made up 31% of the school, but represented 15% of the awards. And that's consistent, give or take a few percentage points in both years. And Black students had a small percentage of the school, 5%, representing 4% of the awards. And then in the school with set criteria, they have a similar, again, Latinx students making up less of the award percentages than the population of the school. And you see that throughout both years.
Gotcha, gotcha. So I'm not going to ask the foundation question. Is there bias at play? Absolutely, right? Either in the system, in the recommendations, in the criteria that it's selecting out for overrepresentation of white students. And I think you have some granularity in there about the type of awards, the effort or achievement, right? Awards. So what did you find in those two areas?
Yeah, so we really looked at it, it was really broad, right? So there's nothing about these awards that say you have to have a certain you know, GPA, or you have to have a certain mark on your report card to earn one of these awards. It was very open, right, at both schools. At the school with some criteria, they really talked a lot about wanting to give the awards for hard work. And you see that play out in what teachers say about students. So in that school, you see a lot more awards around hard work across the board. So 96% of white students who received awards had a comment about hard work. 87% of Black students at the school, and 92% at school of Latinx students, right? So you have these really high percentages where when you look at the school without criteria, you don't see that consistency across. In fact, you see 45% of white students who received awards are noted as hardworking, 17% of Black students who received awards noted as hardworking, and 39% of Latinx student awards. So you see more discrepancy across than you do when you kind of put hard work as something that you're looking for and to recognize. Yeah.
And so we have to speculate, right? Because we say these are sort of public awards, right? That students receive individually, but it also is recognized throughout the school and other student experience by proxy who's getting which awards.
Mhm.
So speculate what could be the possible effect on the sort of the socio emotional development of students, the psychological development of students when
Mhm.
this innocuous pattern continues over time.
Yeah. I think it's exactly what you described. And, to be honest, I've seen kids ask, again, this is throughout my career, not this is when I was a teacher. I've heard kids ask, why didn't I get an award today? I want an award today. And sometimes it's like, well, you work really, we work really hard and get an award. And then the next year comes around and no award again. And so I think that it certainly has an impact, right? And whether that is, like you mentioned, you might not be able to verbalize or precisely, put your finger on it, but there is definitely, I think, an impact for students when what we learn that all the time, when what we reinforce, right, when we recognize, then often we get, students who want to replicate that recognition. And this is just small things, even a thank you, even I appreciate the way you did this, even a small word from a teacher can reinforce positive behavior. Likewise, teachers can reinforce, behaviors, non-teacher pleasing behaviors. And so, and when we think about it in terms of awards, graduation awards, any type of kind of school-wide classroom awards, we are reinforcing something for kids every time we do it. I think what I would encourage here is for practitioners and for educators to be very aware that just like all this attention we focused in on discipline and negative consequences, the impact of what we do to recognize students also has an impact not only on the student you're recognizing, but on the other students as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, there definitely is an impact, and it's likely negative to those who are left out, who are
Mhm.
constantly outside of sort of the reward system or severely underrepresented. And so I want to frame it around an example that I often use in one of my experiences when I was supervising a aspiring principal at a school building. And then I want to get to like what then to do, because this is an example of like what I think is like not to do, right? So I was visiting a school building, doing a side by side observation with one of the graduate students who were in the principal licensure program in my supervision of instruction program. Came to her school. We were walking down the hallway. And I noticed that in the school is very racially diverse, right? I didn't have the exact demographic, but I'm like, this is a very diverse school, right? More diverse than the school that I worked in. And so I was walking down the hallway, and I remember it was October, And we're walking down the hall when I passed by their PBIS Student of the Month board. So they had one student from each, or two students from each grade, because it was a middle school, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade, and they had a picture up there, and they're all holding their award. And I walked by and I looked at, August, September, and then I saw October, right? And I walked by and I noticed just at a glance that all the students were white. And I had to stop for a minute, and I went back and I was like, huh, all the students, because it reflected my experience as a student as well. It's like they're all white, and when I look around this building, you have like Latino students, you have Asian students, you have Black students, but not a single student on that awards board is of color. And so I asked my principal intern, I was like, what's happening here? Have you noticed this before? And she had noticed. It was just sort of innocuous. She passed by that board all the time. I was like, well, I'm not going to address it with your principal, but you can if you choose to, right? It
Mhm.
depends on your relationship with the principal. And so she chose to, right? So I didn't press her to do it at all. I left the building. And she talked to the principal. She said, the principal, of course, white woman, started crying, didn't realize that she felt so guilty about it, right? And so flash forward, it was the end of the semester, and it was our
Mhm.
second side-by-side visit in December. I went back, walked by the board again, and I noticed that the November student of the month was all students of color. Right. Yeah. So you have white, 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 all students of color. Right. And I'm like, oh no, did we do any sort of criteria analysis? Did we reflect on how this system happens? It was like, nope, let's just pick all students of color and that's going to remedy the problem, right? And
Mhm.
for me, I was like, that's what's not to do, right? Knee jerk, let's put some color up there rather than like, let's investigate why this happened, how it happened, and mitigate the system. And so I'd say as a framework of like, we probably don't want to do that, but how
Yeah.
do you actually apply your findings to a principal that notices that this is a pattern in our school building?
It's so funny you say that because I think about, again, going back to discipline, right? And same thing, when we have disproportionality in student discipline, the answer is not just like, oh, we'll stop sending anybody for anything that happened. No, it's analysis of the system. It's really thinking through things. So a couple of things. One is just like run the numbers, right? So like look at your graduation awards that you give for the last 2 or 3 years. Look at any school-based awards that are given out. Kind of take a look at your data, and then have time to reflect on it, right? So take a look at it, spend time reflecting on it, and I think there's a couple of key takeaways. One is that unconscious bias is more likely to seep into your work when you're under like time pressure and educators are trying to get awards issued, wrapping up. When we think about those time periods, graduation, end of the semester, end of the quarter, those are high stress, high demanding time periods. And so when we're also trying to get report cards done and do all the parent conferences and make sure students have the things they need to like complete the course or like make up any missed work, and at the same time teachers are issuing recognition awards or deciding who's earning, awards for graduation, that time pressure can make unconscious bias even more likely to occur because we're less likely to follow like systems or criterias we have in place or spend the amount of reflective time we really should be spending in issuing awards. And so those unconscious bias kind of even educators who want to be cognizant, it becomes more difficult when we're under time pressure. And so I think that having an understanding about that as an administrator to say like, maybe have off peak times for awards if you want to do those in your school building. Maybe thinking about, okay, maybe we decide sort of graduation awards, those that we can early. So we're not trying to do this right at the end of the year when people are relying on lots of things for kids to get promoted to the next grade, to meet with parents who might need something. So having that recognition of time. And then the other thing I think is really thinking through as not just the administrator, but the leadership team of any school to think about what is the purpose of awards? Why do we want them? What do they do? What do we want them to say? And then, if you have answers to all those questions, what do we want criteria to be? Like, what do we really want the criteria to be for awards? How can we think outside the box, outside of the typical systemic nature of awards, to think about ways to recognize students in really clear, structured capacity? So it's not, we create the criteria we want for awards if you still find that there's a real meaningful purpose in giving them. So I think that it's really not a quick fix. Like you said, it's not an October to November answer. It's more I would say it's more like how we think about systems change. When we think about, strategic planning, it's more of that type of an endeavor, right? And to really be willing to take it on, when looking at if your data shows that this is what's happening, be willing to take on that strategic planning, that systems change, which can take, a year to really create a new system.
Right. And I heard you say it concisely like three things, but sort of three things and then sort of cycle. I heard one, sort of slowing down is what's most important, being very intentional. If we don't have a behavior positive incentive system, slowing down, discussing the purpose, why, what are we looking for, what does it do, being super intentional, not that, oh, we did this at my last school, I want to do this here, and let's just create a
Mhm.
system. Being more intentional around the meaning of it and what we intended to do, because we are teaching students, we are impacting students' psychosocial well-being when we do give awards. So slowing down and creating a very intentional system. And when we deploy it, right, deploying with all best of intentions, right, if you don't have a system, monitoring the data, right, because we could have the best of intentions, right? However, it might have disparate impact when it comes to the point of actually assigning of rewards, right? So paying attention to the data. And if we do already have systems for rewards, pulling the data. Like if you've never looked at data before, let's take a look at who's getting rewards and adjusting accordingly. And then something else I heard you say was that at the point of when teachers are deciding who gets the reward, put it at a time that's not high time crunch, high stress, right? Because that's when split second decisions often result in either racial bias, gender bias, social economic bias can creep its way in because it's happening really fast, right? But the cyclical part is deploying, implementing, slowing it down, and then constantly looking at the data to make sure that our criteria and our practices aren't producing the disparate impacts that we want to avoid.
Right. Right. Exactly. It sounds so simple when you put it like that.
Simply complex, but we know the job of a principal that we actually physically do not have that much time,
Yeah.
right? And we're also under high stresses, so it really takes a concerted effort to carve out time in your schedule and do it
Yeah.
with intentionality. So the,
Yeah.
the the last question I have for you is around what is next? Like, what are you working on now? What is the research agenda? Where are you moving forward? What are you doing?
That's a really good question. I at work am engaged in a couple of really interesting research projects. So, we're looking at how principals are trained across the state and also doing some work around literacy professional development and the impact that has, both in terms of in the classroom, but also decisions we make about going back to that systems change, how things are implemented make a difference. So, what are differences in the way that uh, literacy programs are administered. I think that some of my most recent work, I did some work around critical consciousness, professional development in dual language programs, and thinking about why is it what we've been doing doesn't seem to be working. Really kind of looking at how can we create cultures of critical consciousness so that when we learn about critical consciousness or equity in a professional development session, it's not isolated to that session. How do we create and foster really a culture of critical consciousness across a school? So that's some really exciting work, as well as thinking about, teachers who really are engaging in trying to promote critical consciousness in the classroom, who are really engaging in trying to use social justice standards. What has their experiences been? So a project looks to understand like the lived experiences of teachers, like you said, in this period of pushback. What are their experiences when they try to implement this in the classroom, and both, what they've seen from students, what support they've received from administration, and then also what they've heard from parents.
Oh, that sounds exciting.
So
That sounds like exciting.
yeah.
Oh, can't wait. So, for those who've been inspired, right? Because I'm inspired by Dr. Jillian LaSerna in terms of her work. I love it. I look forward to reading everything in which you publish. If they wanted to know more, like how do we reach her? How do we how do we follow her work? So, for those who are inspired and want to learn more about you and your work, what do they do? How do they reach you? How do they follow you?
Well, you would I'm not a huge social media person, to be honest. So I got off of I guess it's called X now, right? The new Twitter,
Hmm.
whatever that is.
Oh,
I am
yeah,
not on
right.
it. You can, through Google Scholar, if you search for Jillian LaSerna, you can find my publications there. Some of them are not behind, paywalls. Others are, and which is a whole other issue we can talk about on another day. And, also, of course, you can look for me at the Education Policy Initiative at Carolina in public policy.
Awesome. This has been a wonderful conversation. I could talk to you for another hour, right, about your research and your past research and
I
your
always
agendas
can
and things.
talk.
No,
Yeah.
this is awesome. Thank you so much for spending your time this afternoon with us. We really appreciate all the work that you do and all the work that you've done. Thank you very much, Dr. Lacerna.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.